All right, testing, testing. Everybody, Stephen Clyde here. I've been excited to do this episode for such a long time just to talk about ancient Ireland today. We're going to talk about anarchy in ancient Ireland. I'm joined today by Kevin Flanagan from the Brehon Law Academy. You can find that at brehonlawacademy.ie. He's also the program manager at European Students for Liberty. He's done quite a bit of work in this area, and he's very, very knowledgeable. I'd say him and Gerard Casey are the two top experts on ancient Ireland. So, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, just to start, I mean, tell us a little about yourself. Where did you end up politically over time? Tell us all that good stuff.
Well, I really appreciated your introduction, but I would say that Gerard Casey is the real expert. For me, this is something that I kind of picked up as an interest maybe back in 2008, 2009. I started to become interested in the law in general, legal philosophy and things like that. And I was really surprised when I first learned that Ireland had this legal system. Obviously, you can tell by my accent, but I'm also Irish. And
I couldn't tell, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, right. So, this was kind of a real eye-opener for me at the time. You know, I was aware that you could look at law differently in the sense that you had a common law, you had legislation, and then I heard about this Brehon law. And I'm also very interested in history and things like that. So I became interested in this very quickly. I'm going to brush over a lot of my past. Maybe you can come back to it if you want. But I subsequently ended up doing a law degree. Not because I wanted to pursue a career as a solicitor or a barrister, but actually for that same reason, that I was interested in the jurisprudence, the legal philosophy. And at this stage, I was already, I would say, I don't like the word activist, but I was already becoming sort of like socially active in terms of justice, and so I would say social justice, but not like social justice warrior, because it was before that was even a thing, right? But I was always interested in the relationship between, let's put it this way, the individual and the state. And a lot of people phrase that relationship around political ideas. But for me, actually, what was more fundamental to that relationship was the legal side of it. You know, political systems are like products of their legal system and vice versa. So if you want to really understand the nature of this society or the system that you're living in, or any historical system, then the best thing to look at, in my opinion, is the laws that are present at that time. In many ways, when you have a native or a natural legal system, what you're witnessing is kind of the character of the people to whom those laws relate to. Also their aspirations, like a lot of their kind of their hopes for society. You know, how do they deal with wrongdoing? How do they deal with injustice? How do they deal with, I guess as a correlation to that, the economy, politics, and so on. So, I mean, that was back in 2008. I started to get interested in that. And as you said, I also work for Students for Liberty. I've worked for Students for Liberty for 3 years now. I joined as a volunteer in 2015. I joined the executive board in 2016, and then I became a staff member in the same year. And that journey, I would say, towards libertarianism, quote unquote, the political libertarianism, took kind of a long time. But really, when I think back to my youth and so on, I'm one of those people who would say I was always like this. I always had this way of thinking, very pro, like, personal freedom, very anti-authoritarian from a young age. Maybe not having the context to call it libertarianism at the time, you know? So that was kind of a process that took a long time. And like, before I knew about the concept of libertarianism in the political sense, I always associated with the American political party at first, but I would have called myself maybe a free man or a sovereign or something like this. And how that relates back to the Irish law, well, I think that there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of misconceptions about the Irish law. I think it's in many ways being kind of romanticized. A lot of my bubbles and my preconceptions were burst as I began to study it. But reason why it's interesting to me is that it gives an actual historical example of a legal system and a functioning society that functioned in the absence of centralized government, centralized control. And that's a real fundamental difference.
And just for anyone listening, you know, the things you're about to hear throughout this episode, I assume, Kevin, you're absolutely not arguing that ancient Ireland was this perfect paradise, but rather that relative to what we have today, for sure, they had a very much superior system to what we had today. In fact, before we start this discussion, I have For New Liberty right in front of me. I want to read a quote real quick. For 1,000 years, then, ancient Celtic Ireland had no state or anything like it. As the leading authority on ancient Irish law has written, there was no legislator, no bailiffs, no police, no public enforcement of justice. There was no trace of state-administered justice. Now, I guess the first question is that true? And the second question, it relates back to what I asked you. I guess what we're arguing is relative to everything else. Ancient Ireland was a pretty good system.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to say yes, it was a pretty good system, but it depends on what metrics you're using to say what's good, okay? Because some people might have a different set of metrics for determining what's good, but there were certainly aspects of it that we would say may not be desirable in today's society, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. But I would say on the whole, the principles that we can kind of extrapolate from this system are principles that could potentially benefit society today. And I just want to give a little caveat here as well. Like Ancient Irish Anarchy, it sounds great. It has a catchy title. People get interested in it. But the Ancient Irish, they didn't consider themselves as anarchic. Like they weren't going around and promoting anarchy as some sort of like value to aspire to.
Right.
They didn't have words like libertarian. And very interestingly, they didn't have this left-right dichotomy that we have in politics. Socialism versus capitalism. So what I find also very interesting about this system is where those two concepts overlap. And there were some aspects of it that we might call socialist, or they had social safety nets and so on. And there was also aspects of it that, you had to go out and you had to like make the most of the resources that you had. You had to make a better life for yourself, and nobody was going to do that for you. So it's interesting to look at it that way. And yes, there was no police, there was no bailiffs, there was no prisons as such, apart from maybe some natural prisons on islands and that sort of thing. So how did the legal system work? How is this something that we could even describe as a legal system based on our modern understanding of what this is? And the quickest way to give an answer to this is to say that the law was polycentric. What does that mean? It means that the law was focused on the people. So let me just maybe give you an example of how a law came into existence. People would engage in social activities in the marketplace, or, they'd go about their daily business. And over time, a certain way of doing things would happen, like a habit would form. And this habit then would become a custom. And if this custom existed for a long enough period of time, it would be considered to be the way things are done, and it becomes what we would call as a law. So the Irish laws, what I always found very mystical and interesting about them was how they were described as being around since time immemorial. They were as old as the hills or as old as the rocks, beyond living memory. But when you realize that that's only 90 years, it doesn't sound so mystical and so ancient. The reason I say 90 years is because up to about 3 generations of people. After 3 generations, the youngest generation, this custom would have been around for longer than anybody can remember, so it became a law. So the law could change then, actually, when customs changed and when new ways of doing things came about over time, a better way of doing it, a more efficient way of doing it, then gradually the law would change. And it was actually the activities and the interactions of the people as they went around about their business that shaped and molded this law. Not a centralized body, which could be a king or could be a government, who were kind of trying to anticipate future occurrences and make a law or a rule in advance of future events. And now this is where the Brehons come in. The reason why we call it the Brehon law, I should say, is the ancient Irish legal system, the native system. It's called Brehon law today. The word Brehon comes from the anglicization of the word Brihv. Brihv is the Irish word for a judge. So it became known as the Brehon law, the law of the Brehons. We would call them judges, but they're very different from the type of judges that we have, and we could maybe go into more details on that as well. But their role was to know the customs that the people were using amongst themselves. They were to keep a record of the customs that were, already happening in society. and to know the correct way to adjudicate a case. Interestingly, and I'll finish on this, is that the law was not about finding fault with people in the same sense as ours is. Like, it wasn't, okay, there was aspects of it that we could describe as punishment, but it wasn't the purpose. They accepted that human beings are going to like make mistakes, and sometimes they'll make bad decisions, and they can cause wrongs either accidentally or willfully. The purpose of the law was to find an outcome to a dispute that was harmonious, that sort of like rebalanced or offset the suffering that was caused, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by the actions of somebody else.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I guess one thing I want to start by talking about is ancient Ireland was absolutely not an illiterate, non-functioning society. They had very much high literacy rates, and tell me about that.
Okay, that's a great question, and it's kind of a little bit contentious as well, because the age of literacy, let's say, in Ireland began, scholars say, at the coming of Christianity. So St. Patrick allegedly came to Ireland in, I think, 432 AD. And with this, it created a great shift in the country, because in that era, immediately following St. Patrick, the island became more Christian, and you see less like warring, less fighting, that sort of thing. And the written word, even today in Ireland, where we have in recent history, we have great authors like Joyce and Yeats and Wilde, that comes from a very old cultural love for the written word and a cultural respect for the written word that goes very far back. What's interesting is, though, we have in some of the manuscripts mentioned that when Patrick came to Ireland, that the Irish already had books. So, there's a case to be made there that there was already a culture of writing and a kind of an intellectual class. Of course, there was in Ireland before St. Patrick. Now, the reason it's contentious is because in the 1166, I believe, we had the Anglo-Norman invasions, and we had a Gaelic culture, a Gaelic order, we could say, the Gaelic Ireland, which gradually began to get eroded. And in line with that, manuscripts were lost, destroyed, stolen. Schools were shut down. The culture was gradually eroded to the point where now I'm speaking English to you, and it's very hard to find Irish people who will actually speak Irish or can even
really.
Well, I mean, there is a community of Irish speakers in the West Coast, but we study it in school for maybe 12 years, and it's hard to have a conversation with somebody in Irish.
I guess one thing I just want to touch on real quick. What time period are we talking about here when we're talking about ancient Ireland?
Okay, well, it probably isn't accurate to say ancient Ireland, to be honest. It's more to say early Ireland, in the sense that
fair enough.
We're going from the period of the written record, which they started to be written down in the 6th, 7th centuries. Well, that's the oldest surviving manuscripts that we have. Now, what we do know from linguistic evidence and the mythology is that this the system was an oral system originally. That actually goes back to the Druids. And our mythologies and our, cultural identity is obviously much older than that time. It's just that they began to get written down with paper around that period. So when we look at the mythologies, which also the manuscripts from the mythologies were starting to get written down around the same time. And some people who research this point out that there's a problem here, that actually all of this was written by Christian monks. If it's written by Christian monks, well, then there's going to be, the risk of bias creeping in. My feeling on that is that for the most part, they try to keep true to the customs that were already there, because it would be very hard to kind of alter or change those customs because they were embedded into the culture. But in one of in one of the earliest mythological accounts that we have of people coming to Ireland, there's a story about a court case that happens. So, I mean, you can't believe the myths because they're myths, but this was supposed to be an age in antiquity, where we, very, very distant past, BC. And the court case was interesting because it actually recognized, the judgment of this case recognized the right of the wife to sue her husband. And I just find that interesting because our Brehon law is often held up as being very pro women's rights for its time, and for its time it was, but for today maybe not so much. But it's interesting that the very first court case that's in our mythology, if you do it chronologically, recognizes the right of a wife to sue her husband. So it's difficult to say with any certainty, like exactly the period. And because we're talking about thousands of years of Irish history, and I'm glossing over and making broad strokes here, that maybe for the benefit of your listeners, it's good to be aware that this is a very long timeline, and at different points on the timeline, there was like, different factors of the law took greater precedence. So later into the Christian era, there's a lot more of like canon law influence on the laws. There's a lot more like of the church's influence on the laws in the later era. But if you go further back, then it's more, let's say, pagan, for want of a better phrase.
When we think about like a nation nowadays, one thing Murray Rothbard points out in a lot of his books is that for a nation to go to war, you have to get the whole of the people to feel like they're the ones being attacked. But something you point out is that in early Ireland, they had over 140 what would you consider private countries per se, or private. How would you describe that? It wasn't at all like one big, we the government.
Yeah. Okay. So, and there's a couple of strands to that line of thinking. Okay. So the social, or let's say the political unit, was called a tuath. The plural will be tuatha, and you could loosely translate this to say like a tribe, but it's also a nation or a people, or a land. Actually, it's kind of all these phrases are packed into this word tuath. And the reason why we believe that there was around at any one stage 140, 150 of these tuatha was through evidence of genealogies, because each tuatha was connected to a principal clan, a principal family. And this was a very kin-based system. Like the family was an incredibly important part, incredibly important unit. In fact, the family was a legal unit. If, for example, you committed an offense, your family would be the accused. Your whole family would have to respond to that, and vice versa. If someone committed an offense against you, your whole family was the legal entity, let's say. So, looking at genealogies, we can see that maybe there was 150 powerful families, and around these powerful families, they would have their family lands, and the society of the tuath grows up around that. So, is that compatible with today's society? I don't know. There's maybe a conversation for near the end here to talk about how this could work in a modern context. But yeah, it was based around the family, and what I often say to Irish people, that if you have an Irish name, Irish family name, then you're descended from royalty. But that doesn't make you anything special, because everybody in Ireland who was a free person was considered to have that degree of individual sovereignty intact as part of their clan unit. So within each clan, they would the people who were eligible to elect, they were called the Rigdowna. That means the people with kingly material, kingly qualities, could be elected within the tuath to be the representative of that tuath, the chieftain, the Rí. And that was like the king. So each of these two, Ireland was not a united country, which is really interesting in the modern context, because we hear like Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, this whole
Exactly.
conflict that's been going on for so long. But really, if you look at Irish history carefully, it's hard to find a time when Ireland was ever united in its history. Maybe under the King Brian Boru, that's a different story, just for a short period of time. But Ireland was like, the culture and the mindset of the people was very let's say like independent and autonomous, and like the Flanagans, my clan, had their piece of land, and that was their territory, and that was Flanagan country. Even you can look at the place names in Ireland, which I know, especially to Americans, they can seem a bit strange when we have American tourists coming over to Ireland, and they have a lot of difficulty pronouncing these names. But they all come from Irish, and if you understand a bit of Irish, you can see that these place names have a meaning. So you take County Tyrone, for example, in the north of the country, which in Irish is Tyrone. It means owns country, and that was the country of the descendants of the Kennel Own, the Own clan. So there's a lot of examples like that. The tuath itself kind of acted as a socio-economic hub. Like there was an economy within the tuath, and people, for the most part, would stick to their own tuath. Okay. And there is a reason for that, because your legal status was dependent upon your family. Your legal status was dependent, not just dependent upon your family, but dependent upon the acceptance in the minds of your neighbors that you had legal status. So it was, your reputation was very important, and you had a good reputation in the eyes of your neighbors, then you had good standing and your word was respected. Now, if you moved to another tua, you were now a durad, which means an outsider, which means like you would be not necessarily be attacked or anything for that, but you wouldn't have a legal status in the village, in the tua. So if you caused an offense, you could get into a lot of trouble. The flip side of that is, if somebody caused an offense against you, even as an outsider, it was the responsibility of the tua to make sure justice was seen to be done for you. So yeah, you didn't have a legal standing as such, but you would still be protected by the law. You weren't an outlaw, you were just an outsider. So
this is a really good segue. I guess we could talk about how was law and order taken care of in that society. Well, I'm going to link to your Tom Woods episode you were on. Let's see here. I have it written down somewhere. I'm going to link to the episode you were with on Tom Woods, but you're talking about how the idea of restitution over, punishing somebody physically, that's what's valued. So what's the idea of restitution?
Okay. Well, like I mentioned earlier on in the call here, that the rationale that the judge, de Brehon, was guided by was to find an outcome that would like set off the harm, set off the loss that was caused by one party to another. That's restitution. And having studied law academically, I know that within a lot of legal scholarly discourse, there is this big talk about restitution now. They call it restorative justice, and the idea is like it's a question between, well, is it right that we use punishment as like a tool of justice over restitution? So I mean, I guess an example of that would be yeah, like let's say somebody home is broken into and their property is stolen. The offender was caught and brought to justice. As it happens now, that person might go to jail. And now the victim doesn't get any compensation for that. The victim is still without their property. So that's not how it would have been done under the Brehon law. Under the Brehon law, the perpetrator would have to restore that loss. And because it was a willful wrong, there was extra kind of fines on top of, you know, if I just caused an accidental wrong, I had to compensate for the accident. But if it was willful, then there was extra fines on top of that accounted for the fact that it was intentional, and we want to have a deterrent, so the fine was greater. So that's kind of restitution in a nutshell. See, when you have a system where you have no central body to appoint judges, okay, no political bias, you could say, to appoint judges over cases, where judges have a monopoly and they are immune from suit, as we have in our systems. And what you're left with then is kind of a judicial open market, where kind of anybody could act as a Brehon if they were asked to do so by the parties. And what this does then is it creates this market where the reputation of the judge is really important. So if you were a judge who sort of gave bad judgments, or you gave an incorrect judgment, that word would spread around, and then people are less likely to come and ask you for your services again, right? Like by comparison to that, if you're really good, if you're fair, if you're not biased, if you understand the customs of the people and you're able to interpret them and articulate them in a way that makes sense, then your services were sought after. So part of the role of the judge then was to be that person who could, or kind of, I should say that the Brehon came about at a later point in the history. If you go further back into the history, this was the Druid. The Druid is a very interesting person from history, the group of people from history we don't know a lot about, very mystical, but they were kind of like wise elders whose judgment was sought to help the neighbors, help their kin, their clan, their tua, to find a reasonable outcome to a situation. So
well, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of their traditions were passed down, where law nowadays is there may have been 100 laws like added to the books today. There's a book by Harry Silverglade. It's called 3 Felonies a Day. In America, at any given point in time, you're most likely committing like 3 felonies at a time, even if you're doing nothing, because there's so many laws in the books. I imagine in the ancient sense, it's kind of the opposite, that you have a set of traditions, a set of laws that people are aware of, and that's it. You know, the Tuath, the judge doesn't have the power to, you know, tax people or do all these things that they can nowadays.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, how that law works then, is that it needs to be fundamentally based on principle, and it needs to be principles that people actually hold and people understand and are valuable to them. And then if you have a law system based on principle, well, then the detail is easy to extrapolate, because you're always going to come back to these first principles. But what we have is, we have a system that's like over the top with details, that we've almost lost the principles along the way, you know.
And it's all maintained by the central body, which in a way doesn't even make sense. It makes much more sense that, you know, I have my private community over here, you have yours over there. We can communicate with each other. But, you know, the fact that I would try to come now and try to rule over you and try to rule over both our territories, it can cause nothing but error.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with something like justice, there should be some, I don't want to say, like, it should be something deeper than respect for the law. Like, in our system, we have phrases like, you know, don't get on the wrong side of the law. It's something to be afraid of. People drive down the streets and they see a cop car, and they might not even be doing anything wrong. But as you say, maybe they are. They don't know. And people get nervous and people get afraid when they see the enforcers of the law, where really, if the system was really just a system, then why would you feel nervous or intimidated when you see this? And I think that part of the problem is, it's like that we've lost that connection to the law, that it was ours, that it was part of us, that it was for our benefit, that we understood it. So there was an Irish barrister who wrote on this topic, and this was still in the time before Irish independence, I believe. Maybe in the last century, he wrote saying that the Irish irreverence for law, it doesn't stem from sympathy with crime, but the Irish, who have a long memory, realize that the law in Ireland today is not Irish law. And however just it might be, and it was once most unjust, it does not command reverence as a native institution. That's the key. Reverence as a native institution, but just respect as an essential part of the machinery of government.
And I think what we'll talk about next is kind of how this became undone. But you give an example in one of your talks. You talk about an Ireland versus Austria a football match, and I guess someone in the match had their wallet stolen or something. So tell me about that, and tell me how that relates back to this idea.
Okay, so just keep the idea of restitution in mind here, but just to kind of flesh it out a little bit, you know, as I said, if you caused wrong to somebody, it was you or your clan's responsibility to rebalance that wrong, to offset that wrong. Now, what happens in the case where you are an outsider, you're an Ard, you come to my community, somebody, we don't know who, mugs you, somebody harms you, damages you in some way. It was a principle of the law. It was a principle of the community that you had to get justice. You had to be restored, because we don't want you to leave our community and go to the next town and say, those guys over there, I just got mugged in their community. They don't have a respect for justice. Like, it gives a bad reputation to our entire community. So first of all, the first thing this creates is a social incentive to actually bring offenders to justice. So if I knew that it was my cousin who had done this, and if he doesn't get brought to justice, my family and every other family is going to have to pay you money to restore you, like an insurance, social insurance, I guess, for want of a better phrase, but like an insurance. Well, then it kind of creates, it's a self-executing justice system. Okay, so there's that side to it. This was called a secret crime. When a secret crime was committed within the precincts of the Tua, it became the responsibility of the Tua, by proxy of the king, you know, to restore you to justice. So what happened is, many moons later, bringing it up to more or less modern times, I think it was around 2009, there was a friendly international football match happening in Ireland, in Dublin. And it was, as you said, Austria versus Ireland. And a couple came to visit Ireland, and they were doing all the touristy things. You know, they wanted to go see the Guinness factory, and they were seeing the sights. And somewhere along the way, they got mugged on the street. And obviously, they didn't know who mugged them. They took their wallets and their phones, and they ran away. Somehow or another, the Irish fans found out about this. And you know, like football teams have their fan clubs and things like that. So the fan club found out about this, and they put it out on the internet saying, like, you know, more or less saying, people have been wronged. Visitors to our land have been wronged. It's our responsibility to make sure that we fix this. They did a whip around, or we say like a collection for money. They actually raised more money than that was stolen, so that was then given to a charity. And they contacted the Football Association of Ireland to get them replacement tickets. So that's restitution. That's a great example of it in a modern context. And do you know what? Like, nobody had to tell them to do that. That didn't have to be written into law. Like, you know, if it's a legislation, if somebody comes and this happens to them, it was felt that this was the right thing to do.
And by the way, I misunderstood the story at first. Sorry, I'm echoing. I misunderstood the story at first. I thought it was about one of the Irish players was hurt, and like all the people from Ireland were coming to protect their Irishmen. Well, it was actually the opposite. It was someone from outside the country who was wronged, and to keep up the tradition, they said, "Hey, you know, we don't want people to be wronged in our country because this isn't the way we are."
Yeah, and I think the important thing to point out here is that those people didn't realize they were keeping up a tradition. Like, it wasn't they're like, oh, under Brehon law we used to do this, so let's do it again. It was just that was felt to be the right thing to do, and it was the right thing to do. And
it's kind of like you said, the Irish have a long memory.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say it's like justice in action. Justice is not a philosophical idea. It's something that, I mean, it's felt. It's something that you know when you're being treated unfairly because you feel it in your stomach. You're like, no, I'm being treated unfairly. So maybe I can tell you a quick story from the mythology that highlights this. That highlights this as well. It's the Judgment of Cormac. So Cormac was one of our most famous mythological kings. People generally believe he was a historical character, obviously with a lot of mythological characteristics put onto him. But to make the long story boring, he was raised in hiding because his father was previously king, King Art, and he was killed, and the throne was kind of like usurped and taken by someone who we would say was not like rightful king, because he was a usurper, right? He wasn't elected, but he was using force to kind of to keep the kingship. And so Cormac was raised as a young boy outside of public life. And at the Hill of Tara, which was one of our most significant political centers, it was the seat of the High Kings, and this is where this story supposedly took place. There was a young farmer woman who had a sheep, and the farmer woman's name was Benaid. And Benaid's sheep once escaped and managed to get into where the queen kept special crops, and they're called woad, and they were for dyeing clothes. Very expensive crops. And the sheep began to eat these crops. So that was a case of animal trespass. Actual loss had happened. It was a clear case for a law, for them to go to law to dispute this. Kings could also take the role of a Brehon. In fact, a king was considered to have, a good king should have the judgment of a Brehon, in the same way we might say the judgment of King Solomon. They were supposed to be judges and to be fair and be able to articulate the principles also. So she consulted her husband, the usurper, and his judgment of this scenario was that, okay, well, the crops have been destroyed and you need to give restitution, so you should give your sheep as restitution to the queen for the crops. Now, that sounds fair. But upon hearing this judgment, there was a young man coming of age in the crowd, and he shouted out, so this is the false judgment. This is an incorrect judgment. And then the interesting thing with the Brehon law is very poetic, and they try to always articulate it in terms of principles of nature that were observable in nature. So he said, as the crops will grow back on the land, so will the wool on the sheep's back grow back on the sheep. So you should shear the sheep of its wool and give the wool as restitution to the queen, so not deprive this lady of her livelihood. Now, both of those are good. They're both answers to the problem, but one of them is qualitatively a much better outcome because you feel it. And then the story goes that the people who were in attendance, because often these were done in the open air that anybody could watch, were taken aback by this and said, "This is surely the judgment of a king." And this is how Cormac became recognized as the son of his father, and then eventually he became king. One of our great kings who apparently wrote a manuscript called the Book of Achill, which is a book of Brehon law that deals with the kind of wrongs, civil wrongs, harm and stuff like that, rather than civil cases.
Well, this has been endlessly insightful. Sometimes I'm worried I'll have guests on, we'll get through all the information in 10 minutes, and it'll just be like an awkward silence. I mean, we've gone on for nearly 40 minutes now.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, I've been wanting to have either you or Gerard Casey on to talk about this for such a long time. You've answered pretty much all my questions. Well, I guess let's wrap up here by talking about how did some of this become undone? Because you mentioned the 11th century. You mentioned in 1367, the Statute of Kilkenny. So how did some of this start to become undone?
I mean, it was a very long process. And so I guess when you take a cursory glance at Irish history, people think of England, they think of Britain, the colonization. Like, Ireland was colonized long before it was popular, like long before imperialism was a thing. They perfected their art of colony, their brutal art of colony in Ireland before they exported it to other places. And there's even parallels in modern pop culture. So, in Game of Thrones, where you have the Red Wedding, where they're all killed. I mean, that was happening a lot in Ireland, and like families were just wiped off the planet because the rules of hospitality forbade you from refusing an invitation. So you would go for this meal, and then you'd just be kind of like, family would be wiped out, and it was pretty brutal. I mean, but I'm not one of these people who like blames English people or anything like that, because you have to take a wider view of history. And actually there's a role of the Vatican in this as well, which a lot of Irish people aren't at first aware of, because at the time, like, kings couldn't really move without the consent of the Vatican. Like the Vatican was the kind of authority over all of Christendom. Hence, like, when the Vatican said later on that, okay, it's okay to do the Crusades, that's the only time the kings actually started to do Crusades, because the Vatican gave consent. So, I mean, it's a long story, probably longer than we have time to go into here, but actually the English, the Anglo-Normans, let's say, were invited into Ireland by an Irish king of Leinster called Dermot MacMurrough. The reason they were invited in, and I've got like so many things popping into my head here, like the 150 kingdoms were usually kicking the crap out of each other so much that they weren't concerned with the fact that the Vikings came, first of all. The Christians came, and then the Christians first, and the Vikings, and then the Anglo-Normans. So the Anglo-Normans kind of set up a base in what was called the Pale, areas of Dublin, Wexford, Wicklow, Kilkenny, and the English law operated inside the Pale, the law of the Crown, while the Irish law operated everywhere else. And as you mentioned, the Statutes of Kilkenny came out in then 1367, was the first piece of law that was directed at the English settlers. It's nothing to do with the Irish. But what it's saying to I say English, it's more accurate to say Anglo-Normans, but what it's saying to the Anglo-Norman settlers is, like, why are you guys cutting your hair like the Irish? Why are you wearing Irish clothes? Why are you speaking Irish language? And if you go to a Brehon for justice, you are now a traitor to the king. The first piece. So the question that you have to ask there is like, well, why were these people who were aristocrats in their own right, who were granted title and lands to stay in Ireland, why were they turning to these other customs? Why were they turning to the Brehon law? I would say because they probably felt that it was a better system, it was more just, and it was fairer. Later on, then we had a Gaelic revival when the English order, like the Anglo-Norman order, started to kind of decline in its power, and these same settlers became what we call the Isgali non a Gael Féin, more Irish than the Irish themselves, these Anglo-Normans. And they were actually protecting the order in some way. They were like patrons to the poets, they were patrons to the Brehons, and this sort of thing. And even like the name like Fitzgerald, okay, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, one of the most famous Irish American, Fitzgerald is an Anglo-Norman name, but nobody in Ireland would ever like think of it as not being Irish, because they became adopted by the Irish. They became more Irish than the Irish themselves. And so it was a long, drawn-out process. like in Ireland, I should have mentioned that there was a very like distinct hierarchy. It wasn't an egalitarian system. It wasn't an equal system. And if we had more time, it would be interesting to go into that. But they had this mindset of like you paid deference to a stronger king. You gave him tribute. You respected the power of a stronger king. And King Henry was incredibly strong and powerful. And he landed with his armies at one point in Ireland because he was afraid the Anglo-Normans were going to kind of like rebel against him and set up their own kingdom. So he came with like this massive army, the likes that the Irish had never seen anything like this before. And they just kind of, the Lord started to like bow to him and give him respect. And then fast forward another while, and we had this idea of surrender and regrant, which was a policy by the Crown, which said that you surrendered your Irish title as chieftain and you were granted an English title as an earl or a lord. And gradually, like more and more kind of allegiances were done. And it came to the point where Northern Ireland, which is ironic because like Northern Ireland is today part of the United Kingdom, but
right.
Back then Northern Ireland was the last stand of Gaelic culture, where you had the O'Neills and the O'Donnell clan who were refused. So, I mean, there was like some allegiances and then they were broken and blah, blah, blah. But more or less, they refused to give up their Gaelic culture. They refused to give up their Brehon law. This culminated in the Battle of Kinsale, I think was in 1601, where they were like completely defeated. It was a horrible defeat. It was probably one of the most one-sided battles in Irish history. And then very soon after that, in 1607, we had the flight of the earls, which was the flight of the chieftains. When the last of the great Irish chieftains left Ireland, they went to like likes of Italy and France to try and get support, and a Catholic Spain to try and rally support for the cause. But actually, the damage was already done, and like because the order was based upon like the chieftains and the Brehons and all of this, that it began to collapse in place of the English Crown law. And last thing I'll say in this, we had the Cromwellian campaigns, which were absolutely brutal. Like we're talking brutality, where Irish were displaced, murdered in like thousands and thousands, and the famine, all of this. We also had the penal laws, which were laws introduced by the British Crown, the establishment, that would refuse, like Catholics weren't allowed to own property or inherit property. They weren't allowed to. You weren't allowed to speak your language. You weren't allowed to, use your own customs. Which is why Irish people don't speak Irish, because it was actually legal
when people think about Ireland, I guess a lot of them may know about Cromwell moving forward. Is Cromwell still, from what I've heard, Cromwell still kind of like hated in Ireland nowadays? Is that still true?
Well, yeah, I mean, but I say it's culturally true. It's not like people aren't really talking about it at the pub or something like that, but it comes up in conversation from time to time, and especially the circles that I would, move in and being interested in this. One of the issues I think that some people don't know anything about, but those who do are very sad about, is the deforestation of Ireland. Like Ireland, we did have cities, of course, and we had like little clusters of like residencies and Tua, but for the most part, we were lived in the forest. It was a very forested and land, and even you can read travel guides. Travel journals from people who visited Ireland in the 1500s, 1600s. And they talk about this, how like they'd be walking through the forest and all of a sudden they'd come across like a family. So they're very forest people. Even, this is a bit of conjecture here, but I have had conversation with someone who made this parallel between the word like forest and foreigner, like someone who's outside of the law of the city, the wild men, if you want, who lived in the forest. And when the Cromwellian campaigns happened, like there was massive deforestation, and the wood was obviously exported for trade and everything by Britain. But I think that's a tear in the Irish psyche that we haven't actually dealt with. Same with the famine. It's wrong to call it a famine. It's an insult to those people who died to call it a famine. When we know now through historical documentation that food by massive amounts were being exported on ships. It's like potatoes failed, okay, but have you ever been to Ireland? We have lots of food. It's one of the most fertile soils in Europe. I mean, everything grows there. We have cattle, we have pigs, we have so to think that just because the potato crop failed that everything else wasn't is just wrong. So that's another scar that we never dealt with. then the betrayal of the church in more recent times, and I don't want to get like dark here and end on a down note, but like the abuses of the church and the scandals of the church with the mother and baby homes, the Magdalene laundries, the abuse of children in schools, that's another scar that we've never dealt with. And actually, Sinead O'Connor has an interesting song about this called The Famine, and it's like, Irish people, we have this stigma around the world of being like great drinkers, you know, or alcoholics and stuff like that. Well, there's a part of a reason for that. I think that as a society, as a people, we have a collective sort of depression. Like, you know, we're abused as when we were in our infancy, and now we're like adults, and we still have all of these traumas that most of us don't want to deal with, you know. And then, like, there's no such thing as fighting Irish anymore. Like, there's no real, like, passionate, wild, like, you know, drive for this culture, for this identity, for, you know, sense of greatness in ourselves and who we are and where we come from, because we've just been beaten so long. We're great at suffering. We can withstand a lot of suffering, but sort of like a sense of pride, a sense of like, you know, yeah, a sense of pride is something that we don't have a lot of in Ireland. You know, we suffer from Catholic guilt and stuff like that. So,
like I can hear it in your voice that, you know, some of these old traditions probably I wish you could bring back, but over time, statism just gets itself ingrained into the society and just in the minds of people, and they become numb to it all. They don't realize they're part of this big colluded system that doesn't really make sense, that you're represented. We have very few people in power representing all of us, and it doesn't really actually make sense. So,
and it also it's about outsourcing responsibility. I mean, the state is great. It's really convenient if you don't want to take responsibility for your life, you know.
Yeah.
If you want to blame somebody for like all your problems, like, you know, okay, I'm based in Europe, but I see this like huge anti-Trump rhetoric that's happening. Okay, and a lot of it is justified, but it's like, you know, people are stuck in traffic for work and they're like, damn Trump. It's like, it must be so great to have something that you can blame all of your problems on, you know. And I think the state is that. And I believe it was Thoreau who said something like, you know, I'm paraphrasing badly here, but like, you know, in freedom you suffer your burdens and you enjoy your successes yourself. You don't thank the government when you achieve something, like, you know, you start your business, or you whatever it is that you consider to be an achievement in your life or a failure. We use the government for this, you know.
Well, it reminds me of the old joke that, you know, why is the government involved with marriage? Imagine like you find a partner, it's like, you know, me and you, baby, we got something so good. Let's go to the government to certify this.
I lost you there for a bit.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll repeat the joke and edit it out. So the old joke is that imagine you meet a partner and you like her, and she's like, oh, me and you, baby, have something so good, but let's go to the government to certify this.
yeah, like get them in as a third party. So to come back to the point of like reviving these old laws, I mean, this is I'll give you two examples. One from history and one more recent one. Is the one from history is we had the land league in the run-up to independence and like agitation against the English crown. We were fighting for independence. There was the Land League, and these were people like, so the Irish had now at this stage become renters. They were renting land from English nobles, and they were poor peasant farmers. And Daniel O'Connell, one of our great like statesmen, Michael Davitt, people like this, were touring the country giving speeches to massive people. They called them monster rallies. And they're like, you know, like let's like take back our land. Let's like hold on to your homes and this sort of thing. And at the end of one of these meetings, somebody came up to him and said, well, you know, if we get rid of the landlords, who are we going to pay rent to? So that's the problem. It's the mindset, you know. That's the problem. And it's the problem today, actually. The same argument is there today. And then the modern example is when I've often talked about Brehon laws to groups of people, or, you know, at events, people would ask the questions like, yeah, but how are you ever going to get the government to bring this back? It's like, well, that's the wrong question.
It's kind of like how would roads get built without government? Well, people who say that, their imagination's a little bit shrunken at that point. Like, they can't even imagine like how it would happen. It's just they see roads, they know government helped with that, and that's how roads are built.
And I think with the likes of the Brehon law and the other native systems of law, which, I mean, it would be great to talk about as well, but is that actually the government is an ingredient. As an ingredient, the government can't be part of it. It is what it is because it's the absence of state. It's the absence of centralized control. So how can we bring it back today? Well, actually, I mean, one way that you can do it is to start living the principles yourself, right? So if you have a dispute with somebody, maybe let's say you accidentally cause harm, are you going to go out and put your hand out to that person and offer the hand of peace and say, how can I restore this to you? Or are you going to go to the state and you're going to rely on the state to step in because we're incompetent and too childlike to deal with ourselves? That's just one small way. But a bigger, more impactful way that I see happening now, ironically, or not ironically, like surprisingly, is through technology. I've spoken about this topic at the Hackers Congress in 2016 in Prague, and I have a lot of people in the blockchain area who are like really interested in this idea of Brehon law model of governance, because from what I can gather, like these principles that we're talking about, non-status solutions to everyday problems, are what they're trying to fix with likes of smart contracts, with likes of private communities online, with even like Bitcoin and blockchain, cryptocurrencies that are unregulated outside the state means of exchange. Well, in order for that to function and sustain itself for a long time, it needs to have ways to solve issues and self-executing solutions to problems that are going to arise. So I think that's where the correlation is there. And I know two people who are working on two different blockchain projects. One of them is called Higher Vibes, and in his white paper he says this is going to be structured on the principles of Brehon law. And the other guy is doing sort of like a decentralized internet. It's called N22 MadeSafe. And within this kind of platform, there's a grading system of status. And he's actually used the words from ancient Ireland. He's an English guy. He's used the words from ancient Ireland as part of his model of what he's building. To me, that's amazing. That's like it is being revived, but in a way that couldn't have been expected or imagined,
Well, we need more Kevin Flanagans out there to tell us information. I mean, this is, like I said, been endlessly insightful. So tell us a little bit before we wrap up. I want to mention one thing. You mentioned to me offline that you're working on some type of masterpiece, maybe just the culmination of all your work. Is that something you're ready to unveil? If so,
well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I was kind of joking when I said masterpiece, was like maybe I'll have many masterpieces. But okay, so I set up the Brehon Law Academy in 2013, pretty much as a response to what I seen was this lack of knowledge, and I had this big passion, and I was like, nobody's talking about this, nobody knows about this. I'm going to make this, and my goal behind this is to take these ideas, and there's a lot of material out there, there's a lot of books, but some of them are hard to read and they're hard to get, and not everybody's going to go through them. So I want to take this and put it into modern mediums through, audio, through, interviews like this, making videos and online courses. So my main goal was that I wanted to make a course about Brehon law that would teach people everything they needed to know from A to Z. When I set out to do this, I realized that in order for that to work, I needed to build a lot of context. So before I could talk about the Brehon law, I actually needed to talk about early Irish society and the Tua and the social system and all of this. So that was the first course that I made back in like 2015, I think. Then that followed up then with the Irish mythology course, which again gives a lot of examples of how the law might have worked in practice through the art of storytelling. And if now, finally, I feel ready that I'm able to work on the Brehon Law course. So all my courses so far, the other two courses are available on Udemy. One's called Ancient Ireland's Culture and Society. The other one is called Irish Mythology. The third one will be on Udemy as well, probably be called Brehon Law, Early Irish Legal System or something.
Now, does BrehonLawAcademy.ie, does that link back to Udemy, or should I link to the Udemy as well?
I can give you the link for the Udemy, but if people go to BrehonLawAcademy.ie and click on the tab that says courses, it'll bring you to a page that basically you can get access to the two courses there. Other projects.
I tell you what, after this conversation, I want to go get the courses down because there's so much history involved that obviously we can't even cover it in an hour. Like you said, I could see you sitting there, like you could probably go off another 3 hours just talking about stuff. So we might need to do another episode.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a few other projects I'm working on as well. Like I have a book that I'm been writing. I mean, I had a master's to go and do, so that was kind of interrupted. But I'm writing a book right now about Irish place names. Like I mentioned earlier on, there's a lot to be learned from them. A few different reasons for that. Partly because, like I said, a lot of Irish people aren't using Irish, aren't speaking Irish. I want to give them a reason that it's actually useful, the place names. But actually, you can learn a lot about Irish history through the families that lived in the land, the mythologies, and all of this. So that's in the pipeline as well. But you know, it's not a full-time. This is not a full-time job. It's like something that I'm passionate about. I would say it's more than a hobby. But you know, right now, like a lot of my focus is going on Students for Liberty, working on developing trainings there. You know, we have our top leadership retreat coming up later in the summer. And yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to be working with Students for Liberty. I love the work that I'm doing there, and I love the mission that they have. So that takes up most of my time. And this is kind of on the side.
Well, hey, I love what you're doing. I mean, I think anyone listening to this episode most likely is hearing this stuff for the first time. Just imagine, you know, a few hundred more people, a few thousand more people listening to this. It's what we need. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Kevin. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks so much.
All right, I'll see you next time.
Bye.